So we're here today with Dr. Sandra Naddaff, who's one of the world's experts on translations of The Thousand and One Nights, which she teaches regularly with us at Harvard. Thank you so much for coming today.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
This is such an interesting history of translation where the Alf Lai La Walai becomes world literature really in translation.
Absolutely.
And maybe becomes literature for the first time. What would you say its status was before it hits Europe?
It has such an interesting history, both as an Arabic text but also as a translated text. As an Arabic text, of course, it doesn't have an official concrete status. It is, after all, oral literature, and like all oral literature, it's been subject to transformation. We know, in fact, that it didn't even originate in the Arab world. The frame story probably came to us from India. The names of the characters, Scheherazade, Shahryar, Dunyazad, are Persian names, so we figure it traveled up through Persia. And in fact, we know of a Persian source for the original story. And then it traveled through the Arab world, collecting stories as it went along, so into Syria and down. The later tales, the longer tales, we think came from Egypt, in fact. So it has a very uncertain, one might say, and perhaps even illegitimate textual status in the Arab world itself. It's not thought to be high literature, and it is to some extent even scorned as literary production within the Arab world. At least that's the tradition.
Now, there were also then different traditions, because there's a Syrian as well as an Egyptian tradition, and they start to add in also poems. Is that partly to make it more literary?
That's right. That's probably the poetry, and one sees differing amounts of poetry in the different manuscript traditions. That was probably a way of improving the literary quality of the work. Probably also a way for the storytellers who were telling these stories to show their erudition, to show their talents and gifts as storytellers, as literary people. But the Arabic itself is in the earliest manuscript, in the 14th century Syrian manuscript, is in fact what we call Middle Arabic. So it's not literary Arabic, it's not classical Arabic, it's not quite colloquial Arabic either. It's this sort of middle realm of language.
Who's the audience for the written version? Is it a sort of upper class audience or a merchant class audience, or what kind?
So we don't have a written version until the 19th century. The first complete Arabic edition is in, I think it's 1835. So we're talking, very early. The first fragment of a manuscript is in the 9th century, but we think these are just notes towards the stories for oral performance. So the first full, complete, if you will, literary form of this is in the 19th century.
And that's the century after it goes into French through Galland.
That's right.
Now, does he get interested by hearing or by reading something?
So we think that Galland first discovered the Sinbad story in an isolated manuscript in Syria, I believe. And he read it, he was fascinated, he heard that it was part of a corpus of stories that belonged to this work called Alf Layla wa Layla. Of course, what we know now is that Sinbad was not part of the core stories of The Thousand and One Nights, at least in its earliest version. It was incorporated later, largely because of Galland, in fact. But he found the Sinbad story, he read it, he translated it, he was fascinated, and then he went on to search for a larger collection of these stories, and he found them in the so-called Galland manuscript, which is this 14th century manuscript he found in Syria, in the Levant. And we think originally that had 4 volumes, but what we have remaining today are only 3 volumes and 221 nights. We know that it probably wasn't a full 1,001 nights, but Galland began translating it, and in 1704. It was enormously successful, hugely popular. The publisher went wild, and there was enormous demand for more and more stories. And so Galland found himself needing to complete this incomplete work. And one of the interesting things he did was rely on an oral source. Himself, a man named Hanna Diab, who was a Syrian, and who would tell Galland stories of the 1,001 Nights sort. And Galland first probably recorded the stories fairly carefully, but as time went on, started simply taking notes towards the stories and then completed them himself, so in fact authored a certain number of those stories, thereby authoring in a certain way, in a way it hadn't been before, The Thousand and One Nights itself. It's very interesting, too, that the stories that we in the West think of as the great Thousand and One Nights stories, Ali Baba, Aladdin, Sinbad, are not in fact part of the original corpus. Those are stories that Galland either found in isolated manuscripts or took down on the basis of Hannah Diab's notes.
And do you think that those stories, which were particularly attractive to him, became famous because for some reason they have more attraction for a European audience? So, is something about those stories that differs?
It's a good question. I think that the answers are different for different stories. The Sinbad cycle, the 7 voyages of Sinbad, it's one kind of story. On some level, it's almost an ethnographic account, not unlike Ibn Battuta's travel account. So it's really, on some level, sure, it's about great adventures, but it's also describing different cultures, different peoples, different kinds of behaviors. It has almost that anthropological, ethnographic interest, as well as the
in which there's a lot of interest in Europe at this time of European expansion and getting to know the world.
Right. What I find very interesting, though, about the Aladdin story, for example, or the Ali Baba stories, they're narratively quite different, I think. Their character development in both of those stories is much more complete than it is in many of the other more traditional Thousand and One Nights stories. The narrative line is developed more fully.
So they're more novelistic.
Far more novelistic and far more interested in an interior life and in the civilizing impulse that literature can have. Of course, again, at this, if you think about the fact that Perrault published his fairy tales in 1697, that idea that one uses this kind of literature to civilize the audience, I think that much of that is going on, in fact, in the Ali Baba and Aladdin stories. And I think that's in part because they really were, in many ways, written by Galland. And in fact, we think that the French versions were used to translate those stories back into Arabic. We have never been able to discover original Arabic texts for Aladdin and Ali Baba.